you for joining us today. My name's Hunter Hurst, and I'm a research associate at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'm helping facilitate today. Our colleagues have covered all the technical aspects, so we can go right into the content. Today's webinar is on strategies to support lifelong youth well-being and linking systems of care, and it will be presented by Lyman Letkers, Senior Director at the Casey Family Programs, and Lyman is joined by Claire Anderson, where she is a Policy Fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Before I hand it over to them, let's take a moment to write in the chat box what you hope to learn from today's presentation. Okay, so we have, thank you, Kimberly. We've got new ideas of cultures of well-being. Any suggestions for building partnerships from Judy Elder. And from Mike Swisher, we've got well-being is a new concept to me. Looking forward to learning more about it and love the positive strengths-based focus. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Lyman and Claire.
Thanks, Hunter, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will certainly hope to meet all of your suggested learning goals. My name is Lyman Lekters. I'm a Senior Director at Casey Family Programs, and I've had the privilege of serving on the Linking Systems of Care Steering Committee since its inception, and have spoken a number of times with Linking Systems of Care partnerships about this notion of well-being and really thinking about it from a broader perspective. And I'm excited about the webinar today and going a little bit deeper with you. My friend and colleague, Claire Anderson, who I will certainly allow to introduce herself, is I think what I would call, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Claire, but a fellow champion around this notion of well-being and taking it to a broader focus and actually thinking about it from a multi-systems perspective. So, Claire, would you please introduce yourself?
We are working on Claire's audio.
Okay, we're working on Claire's audio.
Second.
So then I'm just going to keep talking until Claire comes on, and then we'll let her introduce herself.
Perfect.
But Claire and I have been working on this notion of well-being for some time. When she was one of the leaders at the Children's Bureau during the Obama administration, I actually served as a senior fellow at the Department of Justice, and that's where we connected around well-being as an umbrella frame for vulnerable children and families. And so we're hoping to, really talk about that today. We'll present for about an hour, maybe a little bit less, and spend the last bit of time hearing your questions, sharing also some resources for you. Now, I have to admit, I have to confess, and that I was supposed to put together a list of resources for you, and that didn't get done. So there's a couple of resources in the PowerPoint slide. But what I will commit to doing is putting together a list. I'll mention a couple during the webinar, but I'll put together a list. Claire and I will confer and put together a list that will get sent out to participants. I believe we can make that happen, right, Hunter? Send it out, and then send it out to the participants, and then also post it on the Linking Systems of Care website. So I think I'm able to move these slides. Let me see if it works. Nope. Maybe I can. Wait a minute. Okay, I can. Yes, I can do it from the screen. I got it. Okay, I just had to figure it out. So Claire and myself will be presenting. This is essentially what we're going to talk about. We're going to introduce this notion of well-being and talk about the science. There's a lot of science that to help us understand the importance, the relevance of well-being for vulnerable children, families, and communities. And then we really want to talk about how we take that science and what we know about science and apply it to practice. So the first part of this discussion, Claire will lead, assuming she gets on the phone, because it would be much better if she did it than I. Anyway, that's the first part of the conversation. What does the science say about well-being? What do we know from our respective systems that tell us about well-being, the importance of it, and then how we take it to practice? The second piece of the presentation is what I call the coagulating agent. In my experience, both through Casey family programs and working primarily in child welfare, having a history in the juvenile justice system prior to Casey family programs, and then having some experience within the federal government, it became really clear to me that while we call it different things in our respective systems, whether we're working in child welfare, juvenile justice, education, mental health, behavioral health, any of the systems that are touching vulnerable children and families, we're all driving towards better outcomes, but we call them something different. And they don't necessarily translate from one system to another. So my particular experience is between child welfare and juvenile justice, and while the systems are designed to essentially make things better for the young people, make things better for the families, make things better for the communities, they use different language and they don't necessarily translate. So we think this notion of well-being has the potential to be what we call the coagulating agent, the thing that brings all the systems together. And we'll talk about that and talk about this idea of well-being in terms of cross-systems application. How can we bring systems together, build bridges across the silos that we operate in as opposed to building moats around them? And the final part of our presentation is going to talk about how the recent federal act, Families First and Prevention Services Act that Congress signed, or that President Trump signed into law earlier this year, how that elevates this notion of well-being and provides some additional resources, some additional impetus, especially on the child welfare side, to focus on prevention, to focus on resources that go into children and families that improve well-being outcomes and ultimately prevent entry into foster care, deeper penetration into foster care and deep end services, and hopefully prevent abuse and neglect at the front end. So, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll talk a little bit about some resources. And again, my apologies for not having that list prepared for you today, but it will come to you shortly. And I think I see Claire, or I hear Claire.
Yes. She should be on. Hi, Claire.
Hi, all. Can you hear me now? Oh, terrific. I think I was muted. So I'm glad to be on. Lyman, you're doing a fantastic job. You keep going, and we'll have a great conversation here about well-being and linking systems. So hello, everybody, and I apologize for the technical challenges.
Well, we're glad you're on, Claire, and I did introduce you. I don't know if you had any other introductory comments you'd like to make.
No.
Okay.
You did a great job, Lyman. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Well, actually going to the next slide, I think this is part of where you take over the discussion around some of the science that's informed our well-being and in elevating well-being as a priority.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Lyman mentioned that I spent a little bit of time in the federal government at the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, and while there, I worked with then Commissioner Samuels to set a well-being policy agenda. And part of what we did to begin that work was to review the science and the research about the psychological, the mental health, the functional impacts of trauma and toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences of children and families known to the child welfare system. And part of what we began to realize as we were delving into the science is that there's a large body of work that helps us understand what happens to kids and families when they experience trauma, when they have adverse childhood experiences. We've learned a tremendous amount through the brain science about the impact on the architecture of the brain in the face of trauma. We've learned about epigenetics and the stress response system. We know more about allostatic load and its long-term health consequences on kids and families. We've learned about resilience and what improves resilience, what impedes resilience. We did a great deal of research around what are the interventions that are used commonly and have an impact, a demonstrated evidence around helping to improve and address trauma sequela. And so what we did was we really sort of went to school on the science and tried to understand the way that pieces fit together. And one of the things that we learned and we tried to connect the dots around really was around child development and how everything that we were learning kept pointing back to well-being and healthy child development and being on a healthy developmental trajectory as something that was of great interest to us and we believed could serve as a set of umbrella concepts to guide our policy making, our resource allocation, and our decision making as we were trying to guide the child welfare field and its partners forward. Next slide. But not surprisingly, when you sit down to do this and you have stacks and stacks and stacks of research papers on the floor in front of you, along with boxes of markers, you realize that these bodies of science are pretty siloed. They are fragmented. They don't talk to each other necessarily. Work around epigenetics doesn't necessarily get integrated into how an evidence-based practice is implemented or what we understand about neuroscience. And so we were trying to figure out, could we create a way to have it all hang together logically, and most importantly, for our work at the federal level, but equally, if not more important for you in your work, have it be actionable. Next slide. And so that's what we did. We tried to move it all together in a way that pointed to how we could promote and prioritize well-being in every decision that we were making, in every partnership that we were creating, in every discretionary funding that we were making available to the states. And so I think that there is a lesson here, and maybe it's a better analogy is that there's a roadmap for how we tried to get it all pointing in the same direction and bringing together decision making towards a why. Why are we doing this work in a way that is useful and actionable for you as you link your systems on the ground in the states where you're working. The next slide. Yep.
So,
yep.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Claire.
No, go ahead, Lyman.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, so as Claire was doing this work at the federal government, I was serving on a national group called the Youth Transition Funders Group, a group of philanthropies that all fund in the older youth space. And we embrace this notion of well-being, particularly from the child welfare perspective, and put out our own document focused on well-being for children that are served in the child welfare system. During the meeting when that brief was released, and when that paper was released, one of my colleagues who worked at the Stoneleigh Foundation in Philadelphia looked at me, knowing that I was at the Department of Justice working on juvenile justice reform issues, and said, we need one of these for juvenile justice. And I looked at her, and I looked at the framework, and I looked at her, and I looked at the framework, and my most profound academic, deep question was, what would be different? Because as I was looking at this notion of well-being, it didn't seem to me that well-being was different for a child that was in the foster care system versus a child that was being served by the juvenile justice system. So that essentially launched within the Youth Transition Funders Group the development of a framework, a well-being framework that looks at it from a multi-systems perspective. And that's one of the resources that you do have listed in the PowerPoint later, and it should be on the Linking Systems of Care website. So we broke this out into some domains, and I think this aligns very much with the work that Claire was doing at the federal government, and certainly aligns with the science that we were being able to access. We actually brought many of the folks who were working on those issues into a room together to kind of help frame this, or put this framework together, including Claire and Brian from they were at Chapin Hall by then, but brought them in to help us figure this out. So we identified essentially 6 domains, and these are not perfect. We don't think that we have this perfected, but and in fact we missed one. I added it into the third one that's on the PowerPoint. It says mental health, wellness, and spirituality. We really missed in the framework a focus on the spiritual domain, which is incredibly important, and so we have some work to do to figure that out. So I just want to very briefly go over these domains and share with you our thinking around how we describe them, what they mean. So the cognitive, easy for me to say, the cognitive development domain is really about making sure that everything is in place for young people to really maximize their individual growth. That all of our systems are aligned, that they're focused on making sure that there are no barriers to development, that the young people get the education that they need, they get any kind of individual remedial services that they need, that there's no, whether they're developmentally on target or they're developmentally delayed, that there's no barriers for them to become fully functional and have the best possible outcome, so that they have the opportunity, they really have the opportunity to fully develop cognitively. These big words are twisting my tongue a little bit. The second domain is around social support and emotional wellness, and this is an emotional well-being, and this is, again, a place where we make sure that all young people have the social supports that they need from their families, from their communities, from the systems that are serving them, to make sure that they grow into young people that have a strong identity and have this sense of resilience that Claire mentioned earlier, but also making sure that they have supportive and nurturing relationships, and so that they end up with a strong sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem. They know how to, they have a sense of agency so they can speak for themselves, but they have all the things in place that allow them to grow, again, with this notion of social support and emotional well-being. The third one is around mental health and wellness, and I added the spirituality piece to that, but we want to make sure that young people get their needs met when it comes to their health, their mental health, making sure that they have the information, the skill sets, all the things that young people within that naturally occurring, that they're within their age range, that they can manage any mental distresses that they face, and those that have experienced trauma, and this is one thing that Claire pointed out really strongly, that those who have experienced trauma, that we have a sense of, or we have some resources around them so that they can heal from that trauma, that they can actually move beyond where they are and experience some healing. So again, making sure that there are resources that support their mental health, their physical health, and all the things they need to grow into amazing young people. The fourth domain is around physical health, so I talked a little bit about that in the last one, but again, you want to make sure that young people have access to health care, that they have access to the kinds of food and shelter that they need, that they are, they understand how to take care of themselves. It includes regular exercise, even learning how to manage their own health needs as they're, again, growing into these amazing young people. The fifth domain is around safety, and this is an important one because in child welfare, safety is paramount, and we're not debating that at all. We're not arguing that at all. But often safety becomes the singular focus in working with a child. You can have children who are safe that aren't well. You can have children that are in permanent family situations, but they're not well. I think Claire would agree with me that you can't have a child that's well that doesn't have both of those things, doesn't have a permanent living situation with a healthy family and has a sense of safety. But in the framework that we develop, safety goes a little bit beyond safety from abuse and neglect. It certainly includes the fact that they're safe from abuse and neglect, but they're also safe from physical harm in their community. So we expanded a little bit so that we want to make sure that safety, that young people have the opportunity to be physically and psychologically safe and free from violence, abuse, and neglect. And then the last domain is around economic well-being. We really think this is important to focus on. I think all of us know the impact of poverty on families and children, but making sure that our systems are aligned to support families and communities to obtain employment, make sure that families have a living wage, that young people have the ability to earn and to, even as adolescents, earn money and understand how to manage their own financial needs and achieve economic well-being. So that's a big area that we're focusing on in terms within the sense. Okay, I'm losing my words. That's a big area that we're focused on when we talk about well-being as a broader concept. So the second piece of this is around context. So when we talk about well-being, what's the context that we're suggesting? So first, there's this notion of well-being as it applies to children and youth. So healthy children, how do we define that? How do we make sure that we're focused on resources that create well-being for children and youth? The second area is around family. So we believe that healthy children and young people exist and thrive within the healthy family. A healthy family then exists and thrives within the context of a healthy community. And a healthy community is supported by the systems that we all work in. So a visual for this contextual notion looks something like this. So you can see that we have the healthy young person in the middle of the schematic, the nurturing, healthy family around that young person, the nurturing community around that family, and then us, those of us that work in these public systems, supporting that arrangement. And as we think about our work, that is where we really advocate for a strong sense of how we're supporting this notion of well-being across these contextual domains, these areas. I think this is you, Claire.
Terrific, thank you. And I think that going through the domains and the context provide a nice foundation for what's in essence a rolled-up definition. You think about what's the why, what's a good mission statement around well-being, or what's a good definition. And Lyman and I have appreciated this definition quite well, and I'll just read it to you. Well-being is a satisfactory human condition characterized by health, happiness, and fulfillment. It's not a state of being that one's achieves and then it stays there for a lifetime. It's really a developmental process. You've heard us talk a lot today already about the child development, developmental processes, developmental trajectory, and we really see well-being as a developmental process. Defining for oneself, moving toward, and achieving well-being is a continual developmental process beginning at infancy and continuing throughout the course of the life. Indeed, a better term for the process may be well-becoming. Next slide.
Yeah, I think I just would add a little bit to the definition, not to the definition, but to kind of how we thought about this definition. And anybody who is older, like me, that has experienced any kind of health issues, I've had 2 back surgeries in the last 2 years, understands that this notion of well-being is not a state of being that we can somehow achieve and stay at. And so I think often we look at children that we're serving within our various systems based on a certain set of circumstances. So even the notion in child welfare of safety and permanence are essentially circumstances. But if we don't focus on this lifelong issue of well-being, if we don't invest resources and consider that as we're doing our work together, we're missing something here in terms of how we help young people, help families, help communities develop and become well, in essence.
Absolutely, Lyman. And so I think when you look at this slide, you can very much appreciate, and these are just 3 data points, that lots of kids and families are not well and are striving towards wellness, but there are barriers and there are system challenges and there are linkages to be made to get the right services and supports to people at the right time so that they can get on or stay on that trajectory, that developmental process toward well-becoming. We've got lots of kids, 5.7 million children, teenagers who are not in school or employed, disconnected youth, very much the kids that Lyman was thinking about at the Department of Juvenile Justice and with the Youth Funders Group as we're pulling together a well-being framework for those kids. We've got a little over 100,000 kids who are teenagers who are in foster care. Overall, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 430,000 kids in total foster care, and approximately 60,000 kids under the age of 18 in correctional or residential facilities. So there's lots of work to do here and lots of opportunity for rethinking, redesigning, transforming our systems to ensure that we are putting together the right services, supports, conditions in that ecological context we saw earlier to create a pathway to well-becoming.
And these data points are national data points, and these are just examples, as Claire mentioned. You all know the data points that you're dealing with in your respective jurisdictions. So thinking about them from a perspective of well-being, I think we'd encourage that. Certainly, there's additional data since these data points were developed. There's data on substance abuse. Obviously, the opioid epidemic has had a major impact on families and communities across the country. So figuring out the data points that you're focused on in your respective work and discussing it from a perspective of well-being, I think is, again, something we'd encourage or advocate for. So we don't think that you can have this conversation without discussing principles and values. And I don't think that anybody on the webinar today would debate any of these values, but we think it's important to call them out and to really discuss them because all of these components fit into how we work with young people and families in the communities that we serve. And they also fit into our notion of what we're about in terms of helping young people become well. So starting with this notion, and I'm just going to run through a few of these. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but starting with the focus, with the belief that young people are valuable. The young people that we serve have value. We have to look at them beyond the circumstance, that one thing that they did that brought them to our attention, or that one thing that somebody did to them that brought them to our attention. and really look at them from a holistic perspective, and one that says that, you know, you are valuable, you have value, you can heal from this, you can move on from this, and you can become an amazing young person, an amazing adult, an amazing contributor to our society. We think you have to have the value of equity. Racial equity continues to be an issue in all of the systems that we are working in. Certainly, gender equity is a huge issue, sexual identity, all of these things. We think you can't have wellness without a sense of equity in the work that we do. Young people have to have a voice in what's going on in their lives. Lots of you are working on youth engagement. We know that that's a value with the Linking Systems of Care initiative, and we just, again, want to elevate that as a component of helping, again, young people become well. The science really points to this notion of being developmentally appropriate. There's so much being written now on systems reform, child welfare, juvenile justice, education, that are focusing on understanding developmental science. And so we think any approach needs to have that focus. Normalcy, creating a sense of, how do we create mechanisms and resources around young people so that they're not marginalized, that they have a sense of what it's like to be home, to be in a community, to be safe, those things that we all consider for our own children to be normal. Looking at young people from a holistic perspective, we dissect them with our systems, right? And so we really need to think about how we together focus on the whole person, making sure that whatever we're investing from whatever perspective we're serving the young person from, that we, whether it's our responsibility or not, we take into account that we're dealing with an individual that is a whole person and not just a particular piece of an individual that aligns with our work or our system. Family is important, and family, the definition of family is different for every young person, but making sure that we're attending to having a family, having the child in family and connected with family, lifelong relationships, lifelong permanency. We believe that, those of us that have worked on this, and I think Claire would agree, that we've lost the sense of, in this country, of a notion of redemption. Can people change? And so in the systems that we're working in, can we embrace that as a value, that people really can change, and that they are not, that we don't characterize them or label them based on a particular incident, the worst thing they ever did, the worst circumstance they ever experienced, and can we move them beyond that? We have to invest in our workforce. This is a huge issue. So this notion of well-being, culture of well-being, doesn't just apply to the families and children that we serve. It applies to our workforce as well. We have to invest in people who are working with these families, those who are serving in the community. We believe that there has to be a science-based. We're supportive of evidence-based, evidence-informed, promising approaches. We don't think that they're exclusive, but we definitely believe that there has to be a science base to the work that we're doing, and there has to be a focus on communities. Before I turn it back to Claire, I do want to talk a little bit about why well-being. In my introductory comments, I mentioned that this idea of well-being, we believe, is what, actually, I wish this was my term. I stole it from somebody else. But we believe it's the coagulating agent. It can be the term, the frame that brings systems together in a unified and aligned way in serving children and families in our communities. Well-being can translate across systems. So where safety from maltreatment may not necessarily translate from child welfare to juvenile justice or even to education, because safety from maltreatment is clearly identified as a CPS function, as a Child Protective Services function. Well-being does translate. So you can talk about each system and define well-being from each system and bring them together so that there is a translating factor around this idea of well-being. We've already proven that siloed approaches don't work. Focusing on young people from a singular perspective of a system that we're working in have not gotten us the results that we wanted. And so I think, again, this idea of coordination and alignment across systems, well-being can help that. Well-being can help us move in that direction. Well-being allows us to focus on transformation, not the transactional changes that we see day to day in our respective systems, but really transformation. Our CEO at Casey Family Programs frequently opens his comments or his remarks by asking everybody in the room, how are the children? And I think, anyway, that if we can really truly focus on this idea of well-being, one day we'll be able to say that our children are well or are becoming well. And I think that that is, again, a way to move into this kind of transformational focus on systems change and away from the transactional changes that we experience every day. Well-being aligns with the science and the best practice across systems. We've already shown that. I just think that we really need to take it to the next level, allow the science to bolster up well-being, really figure out then how to create a sense of the words again, they're getting in my way, applicability and utility within the practice across our system. So having conversations, and we hope to hear from you today even about some things that you're thinking, you know, what are the barriers to having well-being as a primary focus to the work that you're doing? And then finally, setting healing and wholeness as the goal. Our young people in all of our systems experience trauma, they have adverse childhood experiences, and our families are struggling too in the community. So how do we set healing as a goal, healing and wholeness as a goal? I think, Claire, did you want to add anything?
No, you did a great job on that, Lyman.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to let you then take on this next piece, and that's really around the Families First and Prevention Services Act.
Yep, terrific. Thank you. And so in thinking about the why and the transformation on the last slide and in the discussion that Lyman just provided for us, there is a new, brand new, transformational opportunity within our child and family serving systems to think about well-being in a different way. The Family First Prevention Services Act was passed in February and provides many opportunities to transform our systems towards well-being. There are a lot of ways to talk about Family First and its transformational opportunities that are pretty straightforward. You know, here's the provision and here's what we might do with it. But today I'm going to try and think about Family First through a lens of well-being and talk through where I think well-being shows up in Family First and how we might leverage it to link systems. So there's lots of words on these next two slides, and I apologize for that. And I won't read all of this, but will more or less highlight what I think the well-being opportunities are and what the principles are, the well-being principles that show up in Family First. It really focuses on preventing child abuse and neglect and entry into foster care. It allows the opportunity to promote children living in their own homes safely with their own families whenever possible in a new and different way than we've ever had before federally in the child welfare system, and requires, to be successful, child welfare systems to partner and link with other child and family serving systems and with communities and private providers to stand up evidence-based interventions in mental health and substance abuse treatment and prevention and in-home skill-based parenting as a first line of defense in preventing child abuse and neglect and children entering foster care. So these services are now available for funding federally for candidates, that's the word in the legislation, kids who are candidates for foster care, and serving them in a prevention space is really a new opportunity to think about meeting the needs of children and families in the well-being fears that we described earlier. Family First also talks about reunification and reunifying children and families safely and quickly. Funds can now be used for reunification services the entire time that children are in foster care and for up to 15 months post-reunification. Again, this is sort of a ground-shifting moment, both on the prevention side, on the aftercare side, and for the use of reunification services throughout a time that a child is in. High-quality placements. We know that when children are with any caregiver, particularly caregivers who are their kin or foster parents, that we want those placements to be of high quality, and Family First provides us an opportunity to use grants to support increasing the quality of our foster family homes and requiring the development of model foster parent licensing standards. You probably heard Lyman and me both in the slide regarding kids in correctional and residential facilities as problematic for many kids. The use of facilities in non-family-like settings can be very challenging for kids to develop in, and Family First recognizes that and creates new opportunities and relatively stringent requirements for the use of congregate care, really changing the way and to whom congregate residential treatment services are provided to make sure that only those children who have the highest level of needs, who cannot be served in family homes, receive congregate services. So again, a transformational opportunity. Supporting youth transitions into adulthood. It extends services to youth who've aged out of care up to age 23, which is an extra 2 years of expansion, and allows 5 years of education and training vouchers. And not surprisingly, among my favorite provisions that folks really aren't yet talking a lot about, but I think provides yet again another moment of transformation, is creating plans to meet the developmental needs of children under the age of 5. I could create an entire systems transformation around what is in essence a really small, relatively speaking, provision in Family First. It is among our best and most explicit articulation of well-being and development within the Act, and I'm hoping that states will figure out how to use this robustly. So next slide.
Claire, I think we are missing a slide.
Oh, we are missing a slide.
We're missing a slide, yes, and I don't know what happened. Do you remember what the context of the rest of the comments on Families First were?
I do. Let me open the prior set of slides that I have, and I can speak from them here.
Perfect.
No problem. Oh, actually, that is the last component, Lyman, that I have. We had just broken it into 3 slides, and this is it looks like an old version with it.
Okay. I think the only other thing, first of all, we think that this is one of the most profound systems change opportunities, at least that I've seen in my career, from the federal government. It really opens up, does a couple of things. It opens up the entitlement, the 4E entitlement, like it hasn't been opened before, to focus on prevention and other services that, as Claire mentioned, get us to this notion of well-being. There's also, and Claire, you may want to add some comments to this, but it also requires states to create plans to prevent maltreatment fatalities.
Yeah.
And so there's a big piece of that I'm excited about, and working with states that have high rates of child fatalities. But it's also a place where child welfare, the agency, the child welfare system can't do it by themselves. So as we think about young people who are vulnerable and are at risk of dying from maltreatment, or even dying from other issues, I think it provides some resources that jurisdictions can use to elevate initiatives and even what's the word I'm looking for? Big initiatives on really preventing children from dying in the communities. And I think that is, again, a profound resource that communities have access to. And I think it's something for the jurisdictions that are participating in linking systems of care to really align with. Families First also provides, and Claire described this, but Families First, I think for the first time, allows child welfare now to bring additional sets of resources to the table that align across systems. So much like we talk about VOCA money, the violence money, the violence prevention money that comes into the communities, how can we access that to support the efforts that we are engaged in through linking systems of care? Families First, as states come on board with this resource, opens up federal resources to support the kinds of things that we're talking about: treatment resources, prevention resources for linking systems of care communities.
I think that's exactly right, Lyman. It's a transformational moment in child welfare, and our linking systems of care states have a really unique opportunity to think through with their child welfare partners at the table how to implement this act in a robust, collaborative, thoughtful, intentional, and transformational way. We're, at Chapin Hall, we're starting to help jurisdictions think about how to assess their systems for implementation of Family First and readiness, so that they are able to bring the right people together for planning and decision making. And I think most of our message here is to encourage you all to leverage Family First and to think of it less as a policy to implement, which it is, and more, though, as a transformational moment to leverage and to think through what's our vision for how children and families are well, and how do we use Family First as a tool to get there.
Yeah. And as Claire mentioned, what Chapin Hall's investing in, Casey Family Programs is doing the same thing. We're involved with all 50 states and the territories and really promoting their entry into Families First, their preparation to take advantage of the act, and really see it, as Claire mentioned, as a transformational moment.
And it's
so
nice
we're gonna,
go ahead, Lyman.
No, I was going to transition. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, part of what we're doing is partnering together as organizations, Chapin Hall and Casey, to do that work. And so it's an exciting moment, and I hope that what you're hearing from us both is sort of this infectious excitement about the moment that we're in and its implications for well-being and promoting healthy child development and families thriving.
That's right. So we're going to end this section, and we'll share a couple of resources, and we're going to open it up for some questions and answers, but we're going to end it with a couple of personal stories that I think will help you see or feel why we have such energy and passion behind this notion of well-being. So this first picture is a picture of that's me. I'm not the cute one, but that's me with the first day that I met my grandson a little over 3 years ago. And my grandson, his name is AJ. He was born. He went to term. He was he wasn't premature, but he was 4 pounds when he was born, and he had significant eating issues and blood sugar issues. So he spent the first 6 weeks of his life in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. And I share this story because what I got to observe during that 6 weeks, I mean, AJ came from an amazing family. My son is a doctor of physical therapy. His wife is a doctor of pharmacology. Obviously, AJ has the most amazing grandparents in the world. He comes from a strong family, has a lot of resources and assets around him, yet he was not healthy when he was born. He spent 6 weeks in NICU, and what we got to observe was this amazing group of people, all with specific areas of expertise, with specific focuses of the work that they were doing: nurses, dietitians, doctors, radiologists, chemists, all of these different people. And I'll tell you, some of the most amazing people in the world are NICU nurses. If you've ever gotten a chance to observe them, they're true angels and heroes and sheroes. But what I got to observe was this group of people working in concert with each other, with different areas of focus, different areas of expertise, all about one thing, all about helping AJ become well. And so as I observed that, that really played into my thinking around how we promote this notion of well-being from a systems perspective. If we can get to a place where our systems are working in concert, working in alignment, really focused on the best interests of young people, families, and communities, with the focus on helping them become well, we can see a whole different level of success with the children and families that we serve. And so this is the result of 6 weeks. AJ came out amazingly healthy. He's 3.5 now. He's great. Yeah, and he has a brand new little sister too. So that's another story, but I won't talk about that. So that's my story. I'm going to pass it off to Claire to talk about her story.
And
where'd it go?
No problem. I think they're not here. Let's go on to the resource slide, Lyman.
Okay, I'm sorry. I guess I should have looked at this earlier. Okay. Sorry, everybody, for the technical difficulties. So the Wellbeing Framework is at ytfg.org, and I think it's posted on the Linking Systems of Care website. There are resources available on the Families First and Prevention Services Act. You can see those resources at the Children's Defense Fund, the American Bar Association. Where else, Claire?
There are multiple places to go to take a look at resources around Family First. The House Ways and Means Committee has a committee report from the first time that Family First was on the floor of Congress in 2016. That's worth a read by states as you are technically trying to figure out the intent of Congress and how you might think through leveraging some of their ideas about changing how we do child welfare nationally. Would be one of the places that I would point folks to, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, like Children's Defense Fund, the Child Welfare League of America, the Alliance for Children and Families.
Yeah, good. More specifically to well-being, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has done a great job in elevating well-being within their Kids Count data book and looking at states with a number of well-being measures and indicators, and shows how states are performing against those indicators. But also it helps with this notion of how do we measure well-being. So they have some clear indicators that can be measured, that we can capture and work towards. Again, I neglected to put together the resources. I'll send those out, make sure they get to you so that you can look at them and check them out yourselves. And both Claire and I are on the steering committee, so we're accessible to you all. You can ask us questions. You can send us emails. We're both happy to come talk to different jurisdictions, so if we can be helpful in any way, we'd be excited to do that. I think with that, I will open it up to questions. And do we have some instructions, Amber, for how to pose questions?
For how to post questions?
Yeah, I mean,
You can just use the chat box. Well, I will make sure that questions get put in the presenter chat, and then you can go down the list.
Okay, okay. And I see that Michelle just posted on there that the website is not live yet, but it's coming soon. So I think what I'll do is I'll also send out, as we send out resources to you, I'll send out a link to the WellBeing framework that you can look at. So Kimberly wants to know if she can get a copy of the PowerPoint and transcript. I think that's a yes.
Kimberly, you can download a copy of the PowerPoint. Just below the chat box is a materials box. If you go ahead and select the PDF in there, it's a PDF copy of the PowerPoint. You'll just press download files and then confirm when the new window opens in your browser.
So for those of you that typed in your learning expectations or goals at the beginning of the webinar, how do we do? And don't worry, our feelings won't be hurt. This is a evolving topic, and so we're learning as we talk about it too. So we're really interested in how it applies to the work you're doing in jurisdictions and communities.
One of those early comments was on suggestions for building partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from Judy.
Yeah, I'll say a couple words about that, and Claire, please jump in. I think that's the point, the notion of translation. So building partnerships across systems particularly is figuring out what it is that brings those systems together. What are you aligned on? And part of the struggle is getting folks who have an investment, who are doing something that has an impact on well-being, for instance, to come to the table if they can't see how they're connected to it. So I think about cross-systems work that we've done between child welfare and juvenile justice, and it's fairly easy to make the connection between child welfare and juvenile justice because of the data that shows the prevalence of young people who experience foster care before they get into the juvenile justice system. On the flip side, to engage education, the education system, in those discussions and in those partnerships takes a whole other level of work. And we all know that education is the one system that every child experiences, and they're not neutral in the discussion. Education is either a huge protective factor or it's a huge risk factor if kids are not engaged in school, not being supported in their academic pursuits. So that's where we think a conversation about well-being, how does education contribute to well-being, how is juvenile justice, child welfare, these other systems contributing to well-being, and is there something that you can say about that brings people to the table to create something new?
I think that's exactly right, Lyman, and I would say that the more you organize around common goals and outcomes that are child level, the more you realize that there is a commonality across these systems. Or at least that's what I think the premise that we're coming from here today, and that those kinds of conversations are to be had all the time across each of the groups that you're in. Mm-hmm. And in every opportunity that you have to create a partnership, what are our shared outcomes for kids? And if you come at it that way, more often than not, they're going to have some developmental and well-being component to them that people can see themselves making a contribution to and a reason for them to be at a table that's a decision-making table.
That's good. So I see the question from Michelle, how do communities begin to have well-being discussions with stakeholder groups? And I think Claire just responded to that, and should they be ongoing and intentional? Absolutely. I think part of it is understanding the data in your communities around the problems that you're trying to solve. Well-being is, we think, has utility in being a solution to many of the problems that we're struggling with in our systems and our communities. So well-being becomes the antidote to the antidote to those problems, to substance abuse, the opioid epidemic, violence, overuse of the child welfare system, abuse and neglect. Well-being becomes an antidote to those issues. And so, first of all, understanding the problems that you're trying to solve within the context of those communities, and then bringing together people who can see solutions based on healing and wellness for the children and families that you're trying to serve. That was a little convoluted, but I hope it made sense.
This is Hunter. I'm curious if there is a state that's recognized as kind of a leader on moving quickly with the Family First Prevention Services Act details.
Hunter, that's a great question. I was about to ask the same, and if you can share your experiences with us about how you're doing that, would be terrific.
So Claire was asking the group on the webinar. Hunter, were you asking us?
Yeah, I was asking you, and then
yeah. So I, that's a really good question. I think there are places that are a little bit ahead. I think the state that I know of, anyway, from our work at Casey, that's probably out in front right now is Utah. Most states are incredibly interested, excited about the potential of Families First, but there's all kinds of process issues and machinations. Then you have to take into account political issues in the given states that may get in the way, and who's actually one of the big barriers in some of the states that I'm working in, for instance, is the issue of congregate care and how much change has to happen with the congregate care providers in order for states to draw down federal resources to support those. So there's huge changes around business models and things like that really need to be taken into account. I would say that every state that I'm aware of is really pushing as quickly as they can to engage in Families First and move forward at the earliest possible time, but we know that there'll be a number of them that don't come in until 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah, and this is Claire. We are in conversations with at least 10 or so states who are interested in wanting to jump into an assessment of their system to understand where there are opportunities relative to each of the provisions and how to create a plan to leverage them for system transformation. So we're talking with a number of states about an assessment, planning, and readiness process to engage with Family First. And in a couple of instances, we are already engaged in that assessment and bringing, at least in one jurisdiction, bringing cross-sector partners to the table to create a prevention plan that will be submitted to the federal government. But by looking at the entire array of evidence-based child abuse and neglect prevention programs in that jurisdiction and lining them up in a Family First framework to understand which ones can be funded federally and where there are opportunities to shift local dollars upstream into more primary prevention. And so it's been a really exciting engagement to to rethink how to partner across systems to leverage Family First. So yes, Lyman is exactly right. States are taking due consideration about how to understand Family First, and many states are already engaged in assessing and readying for implementation of some of the individual provisions, but also in doing the really important work to vision how their system will be different 3-5 years from now because of Family First. Now, one could see a real shift in the public child welfare system serving children in their homes, using prevention services in partnership, rather than what is now a reliance on foster care. So there's a paradigm shift available, and I think many states are thinking through how to leverage that.
Do you think, Claire, that it will also bring some clarity and impact youth who are in the delinquency system, and particularly in the deep end congregate system that are not as eligible for the 4E support, or there's always been kind of some vagueness about 4E support for delinquent youth?
Right. So I would say that for states who leverage Family First well, they will drive a shift in the marketplace. They will stand up evidence-based interventions that allow them to step down kids from congregate settings into family-based intensive wraparound or intensive supportive services and evidence-based interventions. And we'll begin to eliminate some of the current capacity of congregate care that is not designed to treat kids with high-end needs. And so there will be marketplace shifting. And that building of capacity of evidence-based interventions for kids who could be served outside of congregate care, if done in partnership with the juvenile justice system, could create even more capacity that might be used across the two systems, right? So if we think about the marketplace shifts only for one specific system, then I think we might miss the opportunity that we have here to think across systems for kids who are, frankly, not all that different from each other, who have the same presenting concerns, who've had the same set of experiences, and how do we craft a service array for them that does not overly rely on congregate care.
Yeah. I think I would add to that, Hunter, that the prevention services piece of Families First is going to be important to watch. So it's a lot of it we don't know yet. There's going to have to be some testing of things and how it's used. But the notion of candidate, and Claire talked about this a little bit earlier, it's still being defined. It's still going to be there's still going to be some dialogue between the feds and the states on how we identify candidates. But even those young people that are in the juvenile justice system could be seen as candidates for foster care as they come out of the system, as they come out of institutions, and be eligible for prevention services. So their families could be eligible for some of the prevention services that Families First would pay for, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. So I think that there's a stronger connection that we can see right now, but as the implementation happens, as we continue to ask questions and continue to test the opportunities and the resources that come through Families First, I think we're going to see a stronger connection between child welfare and juvenile justice.
And this segues really well into Jess's question about and limitations with congregate care options in the Act because of shortage of foster families.
So I'll take the first shot, Claire, if you're okay, and you can clean it up. So the congregate care provisions in Families First are important to understand. So it doesn't eliminate congregate care. It's not asking states to stop doing congregate care. What the federal government is saying is that what federal resources can be used for once a state comes under Families First, is time-limited, treatment-focused residential care. That's what they can use $4 for. So states that want to use congregate care for other things have the ability to do that with their own resources, but they can only get reimbursed from the feds for the kind of congregate care that's defined in Families First. So that requires some evidence-based approaches to be utilized in those treatment services, and then there's other provisions. So again, you can help me here, Claire, but there has to be a clear assessment identifying a need. So it can't be placement-oriented. It's got to be really treatment-oriented. The services have to have some connection to evidence. And there's different levels of evidence that are outlined in the Act. And then there has to be some time limit to it. So young people can't just linger in congregate care for long periods of time. I do think it's going to, for states that rely heavily on congregate care, it's going to create some issues around implementation. And I again think Claire would agree with me, it's the right thing for kids. Congregate care is overused. We're not saying that there's not a need for it in certain instances for treatment purposes, but congregate care in many states and many jurisdictions is overused for placement.
Yeah. I would add to that, and everything you said I agree with, Lyman. In some instances, states and I don't know the specific data in Montana, so Jess, you'll have to help me here, but in some states, kids come into foster care and their first placement is in congregate care.
Right.
And those kids, if you look at the prevention provisions, are well poised to receive an evidence-based mental health intervention or in-home parenting intervention as a mechanism to avoid their entry into foster care and thus their first placement into congregate care. So thinking about your prevention provisions as one mechanism to address kids going directly into congregate care. Certainly if you have a shortage of foster homes generally, and you begin to think about your prevention provisions as a measure by which you avoid bringing kids into care at all, then you're reducing the pressure on the limited number of foster homes you have already. The added benefit of shifting your system in that way, given the way that Family First the funding in Family First is structured, the kids that you serve in the prevention space before they come into care, the federal drawdown for services to them works differently than the federal funding drawdown for kids who come into foster care. So if a child comes into foster care, you draw down your 50% and then you apply the look back and your penetration rate. For kids who are, and so let's just say for a moment, you can apply your 50% match to only about 40% of kids in foster care. Let's just take an average there. But in Family First, you can draw down the 50% match, but you can apply that up to 100% of the kids that you're serving prevention.
Right.
And so the transformational moment, the way that Congress has structured this is quite brilliant in terms of how they are now incentivizing child welfare systems to serve children before they come into foster care rather than after they come into foster care. While I've never been while I have never thought for a moment that kids came into foster care with states to draw down federal money, there has always been the argument that the federal government created a set of incentives that promoted the use of foster care as the intervention. And that has now been changed dramatically, whereby the incentive is now to serve children in prevention. And so when you look at, and Montana is not alone in shrinking foster home resources, Family First really provides an opportunity to think about where we serve kids and families and how to ensure that we are using our resources to the best of our ability to keep kids at home safely and focus on the well-being of their parents and on their well-being as a primary mechanism to avoid foster care placement.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Families First opens up the federal entitlement to support, to invest in families, as Claire said, but also to invest more into relative care and relative support and reduce our over-reliance on foster care. Foster care, by the way, is not an evidence-based program. Learned that recently.
Are there additional questions that participants would like to chat to us? Well, I'm not seeing anyone typing in the chat. Wait, here we go. Michelle's typing. She thanks us for the webinar. So it seems like we are going to wrap up now, and I really want to thank Lyman and Claire for bringing this together and being such leaders to do that, and do it pretty rapidly too. And I want to thank everyone that joined us today on the webinar and your participation. I learned a lot myself, and if you have any questions regarding the presentation, please contact me. I chatted my email address, and I can get you to Lyman and Claire and or others who might have answers to your specific question. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.